And we know these no-carry zones are magnets for killers. The Aurora Theater had a posted no guns sign in there. So that criminal was guaranteed by the management of the theater that law-abiding people wouldn't be able to resist. Same thing that's happened over and over. Mass murders happen not solely, but overwhelmingly in places where law-abiding citizens are forbidden to carry. And that certainly included the park space in front of the Boulder County Courthouse where the recent attack took place.
Boulder, a hotbed of anti-Semitism. For that matter, is the state of Colorado. But first, subscribe and like our channel. Click that little bell icon for notifications. And find the Devil's Advocate podcast on your favorite listening app. Dave Kopel from Independence Institute. How long have you lived in Boulder?
Since 1994.
Okay, I've been there since '84, and I've been in Colorado nearly all my life. And you grew up in Denver, right?
Right, born in 1960 in Denver.
All right. And your parents are Jewish. Is Boulder an anti-Jewish place?
No, for the vast majority of the people, absolutely not.
But why then, and I want to get into this attack, weird things happen in our hometown of Boulder. You and I live there, and it seems to be a magnet for bizarre crimes, including a mass shooting at the King Soopers where I shop. And boy, does it feel like there's some Islamic overtones to that shooting, but we don't know. And then what happened on Pearl Street Mall, where you and I have spent lots of time, that was an act of anti-Semitism, or anti-Zion. I've been told there's a difference.
Well, there may be a difference, but in any case, the flamethrower attack was both. But both the King Soopers attack and the fire attack were both perpetrated by outsiders, not by Boulderites, but by people who came to Boulder to perpetrate the attack. So Boulder may be, I suppose, a magnet for non-residents who want to do mass murder.
I wrote a piece on this. You remember Michael Bell, who was the escaped convict who came up and did a shooting spree in 1990. That happened. You know, people come to Boulder to do weird things. The King Soopers shooter passed other King Soopers on his way to do it in Boulder. This guy passed Denver's version of
March for Our Lives. Run for Our Lives.
Run for Our Lives, which has a Denver chapter, which on Sundays goes and does this march. He decided to drive an extra 30 miles to get to Boulder. And I keep asking, why Boulder?
Well, and obviously we don't know, but so it's all speculation. But for both of those attackers, they may have perceived Boulder as a softer target because it has, in general, within the city, fewer people with concealed carry permits, and in more recently, a great deal of the city, including where the flamethrower attack was perpetrated, off limits to licensed carry.
Let's go over the change in law. You were very instrumental in getting concealed carry laws in Colorado passed. Switched from a may issue system where you could go to your sheriff and maybe if he liked you, maybe if you were connected to him, he would have let you get a concealed carry permit, to what you helped design and got passed here, which was a shall issue, which means your sheriff shall issue you a concealed carry permit if you meet these requirements.
Right, and by the way, besides the objective requirements like passing the fingerprint-based background check, when the Concealed Carry Act was being passed in 2003, it was very much with the enthusiastic support of the Colorado State Sheriff's Association. But one thing they insisted on was what we call the naked man rule. So if you're a guy who sits in his lawn chair in his own house or own front yard, naked, screaming.
So this was not the Caldera rule. It was they had a different name.
Oh, I fought to have it changed, so it was more generic. The naked man, screaming in his front yard about the Martian invasion or whatever. There's nothing criminal about that necessarily. Or let's say he's wearing a thong, and then it would be perfectly legal. But they wanted the ability to deny that kind of person. No criminal convictions, lawfully present in the country, everything right. But they know there's something wrong with it.
There was a carve out for people who were off.
Well, seriously off, that's right. And it has due process in it, because if the sheriff denies or revokes a permit based on that criterion, then the person who doesn't have the permit can go to court, and the burden of proof is on the sheriff. So that's a fair rule, and I agree with that.
What was great about the concealed carry laws in Colorado is that there was a statewide preemption, basically.
Yeah.
The state decided what the rules are.
Yeah.
And as part of the anti-gun mania that's been going on in the state capitol for the last several years, Jared Pohl signed a law that allowed localities to make gun laws more restrictive, not less restrictive, and to put more denials or deny places where you can concealed carry. What was the law?
Well, so the Colorado law is still completely preemptive in terms of the issuance of the permit.
But the ability to
actually use it, that's right. So the Concealed Carry Act, as enacted, said here's some places you can't carry, here's some places you can only carry in under certain circumstances, and the rest of this, and of course private property, that's up to the private property owner, but the rest of the state, on public property in general, you have a right to carry. Then in response to the King Soopers shooting, where the criminal did not have a carry permit, he illegally carried his rifle into a King Soopers and murdered people in the parking lot, and then started murdering people inside. And the legislature's response is, oh, that's terrible. Let's crack down on the law-abiding people. We need to do something about them.
So I look at Colorado's mass shootings.
Yeah.
They've happened in theaters.
Yep.
They have happened in shopping centers and stores. They have happened in places of worship, houses of worship, churches. Boulder came out with new laws of where you cannot carry your concealed weapon legally. And let me see where they decided to do. Oh, theaters, shopping centers, and houses of worship. So where
and parks.
And parks.
So if you get attacked by a mountain lion in Boulder City open space, that's too bad for you.
Right. So basically, every place that history has shown people need the right of self-defense, the city of Boulder has said, sorry, you cannot legally carry your gun there.
Well, and we know these no-carry zones are magnets for killers. The Aurora Theater shooting, the Aurora Theater had a posted no guns sign in there. So that criminal was guaranteed by the management of the theater that law-abiding people wouldn't be able to resist. Same thing that's happened over and over. Mass murders happen not solely, but overwhelmingly in places where law-abiding citizens are forbidden to carry. Of course, and that certainly included the park space in front of the Boulder County Courthouse, where the recent attack took place.
Is that because it's not allowed on courthouse grounds?
Well, you certainly can't carry in the courthouse, which is fine. But I believe it's covered by the city's ban on carry in any kind of public park, which would include the grassy area and the mall in front of it. But you see the difference in results when people can carry. So at the New Life mega church in Colorado Springs, it's about 12 years ago or so,
yeah.
a criminal, and it's a huge church, over 1,000 people, and obviously a confined space. You can't get out very quickly. And a criminal came down there to attempt a mass murder going into the church. But this church had volunteer security guards, and one of the security guard that day was a woman named Jeannie Assam, who happened to be a former police officer from the state of Minnesota, and she was carrying. She engaged in a gun battle with the criminal. I believe at the very end, the criminal ended up killing himself. But the pastor said that she saved over 100 lives. And so that's one of the mass shootings that attempted mass shootings that people just forget about, never makes the international news.
Let's not forget what happened. I think it was in Old Town, Arvada. I'm trying to remember.
That's right.
I forget the young man's name who was absolutely heroic, who took out a man with, I think he had an AR-15, and he took this guy out. Sadly, he was killed by the police,
Right.
Which is awful, but the police said, no, he was a hero.
That's right. And obviously the critics of saying, some people would say, oh, if you have a mass shooter, you don't want any resistance because that just makes the situation more complex, which is true. And that hero in Arvada obviously gave his life to save other people. That's right. If you were shooting back at the perpetrator, there's a chance that some third party, like the police officer arriving on the scene, could make a mistake and shoot you. That is absolutely a risk. But everything in life is balancing relative risks.
I wonder how many people he saved by ending the life of the mass shooter.
Many more than himself.
One of the people killed at the King Soopers shooting was not yet 21. He was 20 and was working to get his permit when he was 21. We can only imagine what would be different if he had been carrying, although I'm sure as an employee he probably wouldn't be allowed to.
That's all true. But the key thing is being shot at is a very distracting thing. Whatever you're trying to do, if somebody starts shooting at you, that vacuums up all of your attention. So if you have a criminal who's trying to shoot people at leisure, as these criminals often do, and then somebody starts shooting at you, that's very distracting, and it's harder to pay attention and aim at the other people. You're going to get distracted and pay attention to whoever's shooting at you, and that will
which is what
save
happened
lives.
at King Soopers. The shooter himself was shot by one of the police who came in first, and then they of course waited 45 minutes to go back in again. But at that time, he was wandering around, not shooting people, actually trying to give himself up. So being shot back at saves lives.
Absolutely.
All right, let's bring it to the Zionist attack, or the anti-Zionist attack. We can't prove that this guy who drove up from Colorado Springs, passing the very same demonstration in Denver to get to the one in Boulder, but it's not a stretch to say Boulder's anti-self-defense laws, their attack on gun owners' rights, could have been a very big factor in this.
It's possible, although Denver's not tremendously better in that regard either.
But the fact is, it is a soft target.
Yes.
You know, there's a reason why he came up, the other guy from King Soopers passed other King Soopers.
Right.
There's something about Boulder. Let's get into speculation. There's nothing we can prove here. Boulder is different. It is a place where people love to emote. It is a place where the pastime is not baseball, it's virtue signaling. And I think a lot of the virtue signaling that has happened in Boulder has been pro-Palestinian and, I'll just say, anti-Israel. I think that might have had a part of this play as well. Speculate. You've been in Boulder long enough. When I got to Boulder in the 80s, and also when I would visit in the 70s, Boulder was always goofy and liberal. You know, there was always some Buddhist banging a drum and walking around. There'd always be hippies doing whatever. But you could have the Naropa Institute, this Boulder Buddhist beatnik college, and right down the road was the headquarters for Soldier of Fortune magazine and Paladin Press. And everyone got along. There was true ideological diversity. Those days are gone. I find Boulder to be a completely uptight, intolerant, hateful place. And I think some people just don't feel welcome. As a gun owner, I certainly don't feel welcome there. Speculate for me. Does that invite crimes like this?
I'm not sure if you can say that, because neither of these perpetrators were coming up there to do their crime and then hoping that a mob would join them, and then they would go march someplace and take over the government. But I would say that more broadly, Boulder, in its classic 1970s sense, was a very liberal town, and that means in
all the best ways.
In the best ways, because liberals are tolerant, they're open-minded, they're open, they like they're willing to think about new ideas, and they're very, very strong on supporting freedom of speech, including freedom of speech they disagree with. So Boulder, and also we shouldn't describe Boulder as if it's one thing. What you're talking about really is the kind of people who were on, for example, the Boulder City Council now.
And the county commission.
Yeah.
And the school board.
Yes. But that's a defect of our political system. But the fact that these kind of intolerant people end up with the power doesn't really mean that the median person in Boulder, let alone all people in Boulder, are as rigidly illiberal as they are.
Let me challenge on that, because Boulder is intolerant. Boulder has a culture, and that culture, I've noticed ever since 1980, continues to become more elitist, more judgmental, more rich, and just more intolerant. They can tolerate a lot of different viewpoints, from crazy liberal to outright communist. Yeah, they can tolerate that. But for those of us who believe in less government, more property rights, those of us who identify not as trans, but as gun owners, we are told, you are not welcome here. Your type is not allowed. Your lifestyle, we find repugnant. Get the hell out of here. It is an unwelcoming place. My daughter was bullied in school because we're gun owners. Went to come home crying because she was called a murderer. That's the style of Boulder. Boulder, I have found, has turned into exactly what we fear, a groupthink that says, I'm better than you and I know what's right for you, and we don't want you here.
Yeah, and I'd say that's true for an aggressively militant, hateful 10% of the population.
And then 80% that go along with it.
Well, that's right. There is, for all the anti-bullying stuff that we've had over the past quarter century, too many people in Boulder and around the country are not willing to stand up to the bullies. When they see the bullying going on, they don't do something about it. They don't support the victim. They don't intervene and do something to the perpetrator.
Further, I don't think they recognize it. Now, they would recognize it if there was an LGBT person being bullied. They would recognize that. If there was an Islamic person being bullied, they would recognize that. If it is a gun owner who feels like he has to stay in the closet, or in Boulder, where I know people who would like to put out a Trump sign on their yard, but will not do so because they don't want to get vandalized, or they don't want to lose their job. Or people who say, I don't want to use that pronoun at work, but I have to feed my family. So I will lie and say he's a she to go along and get along. So yes, there's a militant part, but it is part of everyday life in Boulder, and I'm going to say more and more so throughout Colorado.
All true, but recognize that the non-bullies and the normal people are the overwhelming majority. There's a lot of sociological studies about how group controls work. And if you have a 5% group that is very militant and works hard and is aggressive, they can often intimidate the more passive 95% into going along. And what stops that ultimately is when somebody in that 95% majority stands up and says no. And then person two, having seen one brave person, they may stand up. And then that leads to the third, the fourth, and the 200th person standing up, and it's called the preference cascades, as people reveal what they think, like in the Warsaw Pact and the slave states run by the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. When the first shopkeeper in Warsaw pulls down the communist poster that he was supposed to keep in his store window, then more and more people start revealing their preferences, and all of a sudden that communist system that everybody went along with for half a century because they were all afraid suddenly gets revealed as a paper tiger.
The difference is, I don't know if Boulder or Denver or Colorado at all is ready to tear down those posters. I fear that they're willing to put them up. We have a legislature that just passed a misgendering bill saying you don't have the free speech, and we will legally say you are discriminating and punish you if you don't use the speech codes we want.
Right. So let's see if I can break the law.
Please.
Preemptively. A mediocre male swimmer named William Thomas was swimming for the University of Pennsylvania men's swim team because he was a man. And in the national rankings, he was nothing, deep into the hundreds. Then he started pretending to be a woman and pretending that his name was Leah. And then he switched to the women's swim team where he could walk around, and did, exposing his male sexual organ to females 18 times per week. And on the women's swim team, because he was a man, he was bigger, stronger, had faster twitch muscles, more muscle strength, all those things. And he became a very high-ranking swimmer in the women's competition, just like you and I, who are horrible golfers. But if we identified as 6-year-olds,
we'd still be terrible golfers. We golf. I've seen you golf.
Well, that's true, but I think we can probably you and I can easily, on a good day, hit a golf ball from the tee well over 75 yards, and most 6-year-olds can't. So
if we identify as 6-year-olds, we do well.
We would certainly be higher ranked in 6-year-old golf than we are in adult male golf. And he did the same kind of thing. He's a liar and a cheater. And he's not a woman. He's a man who cheats by pretending to be a woman.
And what you've done right now is you have done an act of discrimination by law in Colorado, and you could be brought up for punishment by our Equal Rights.
The Civil Rights Commission, which is a very, in Colorado, the Civil Rights Commission is kind of anti-civil rights. The Anti-Civil Rights Commission.
But the point being, you're saying that most Boulderites might not be like this, most Coloradans might not be like that. Reality suggests otherwise. Coloradans voted for people who overwhelmingly voted for this anti-free speech law. They overwhelmingly voted to to allow Boulder to disarm Jews so that they could be victims, to disarm people in shopping malls to be victims. So they're the ones who have done this. I believe this bullying is omnipresent in Colorado. I think people who think the way you and I we're anomalies. We're willing to say this because your job is not on the line when you call that swimmer a dude.
That's all true. And a lot of people in the world are, even for things they do outside of work, are subject to human resources departments. And for folks who didn't know that, the human resources department is not there to help the humans who work for the company. The human resources department is there frequently as the Stasi, the East German secret police, to keep the employees in line for the benefit of the management.
Let's bring it back to the Boulder attack. You grew up in Colorado, so did I. Is Colorado becoming more anti-Semitic? Is it
Absolutely.
Put some meat behind that.
So I was born in 1960, and that is, I came into a time which was now in retrospect seen as the golden age of American Jewry. Now, right from the beginning of American independence, the United States never had any laws against Jews, any legal discrimination against Jews. And George Washington wrote a famous letter saying that we've got no official religion in this country, and Jews, among others, are totally welcome here and they can do their thing. That said, there was, in some places, social discrimination against Jews. You couldn't get into
Country
this
clubs,
club or
right.
that, or a law firm. If you were if you were Jewish and you went to Columbia Law School in 1948 and graduated close to the top of your class, you would not get job offers from the top New York City corporate law firms, even though if you'd been a Presbyterian with exactly the same record, they would have gladly given you a job offer. So that existed, but even that kind of discrimination became more and more socially unacceptable. And there was also discrimination against Italians at that same time. And Frank Sinatra in the 1940s did a famous commercial about, is your school all-American? And by all-American, he was saying is like, you don't pick on the Italians and discriminate against them. And the same point for the Jews. So by this, in the 50s, increasingly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, being Jewish was something that it was very legit in America to be Jewish. You didn't have to be assimilated. You didn't have, in the sense of, like, you hide your Jewishness. Oh yeah, that's something I do on Saturday, but in the day-to-day, nobody can even tell I'm Jewish. It wasn't like that. You could be out, visibly Jewish, act Jewish, talk about being Jewish, and it's like, okay, so what? He's this, somebody else is that, whatever. That's just part of the, interesting culture, melange of cultures that we have in the United States. Since then, things have gone way downhill because there is a lot of overt anti-Semitism in this country, including in the violent attacks as the most extreme example.
Nazis hate Jews.
Yes.
But it seems like most of the attacks on Jews is coming from the political left in America, not the political right. We see it in the anti-Israeli protests. We see it on college campuses. We see it in cities. We see members of Congress. We see members of the state legislature with their pro-Palestinian flags on their desks. But somehow they're not Nazis. And I'm confused because I thought it was the Republicans that hated the Jews. Now it's the Democrats that hate the Jews. Help me out.
On the politics of it, on the politics of Israel, as of the early 1970s, it was pretty much required for most Democrats to be pro-Israel, which they naturally were, because it was a small democracy in a sea of dictatorships. Just like President Kennedy said, that Israel is going to survive and it's going to thrive and it's a beacon of democracy. And it was only some far-right Republicans who were like, oh, we're pretty skeptical about that whole thing. And then Jesse Helms, very, very, very right-wing senator from North Carolina, wrote a famous essay for the Heritage Foundation's magazine, Policy Review, called Why I Changed My Mind About Israel. And that was sort of the last domino that fell. And then everybody in the Republicans of the time, who were very national security, anti-communist, it was easy for them, and most of them already did, agree that being pro-Israel was just an extension of being pro-US because they share our values. You were right that the dominant political power of anti-Semitism in the United States is on the left. But before we talk about that, I want to say that it exists on the right. I saw it on the fringes of Twitter in support of Trump in the 2016 campaign, when you had really loathsome anti-Semites criticizing people who would against people who would criticize Trump. And it's been much more mainstreamed, at least in some zones of the right. Most, including people like Candace Owens, and maybe people in the audience haven't heard of her.
You think she's anti-Semitic?
Yes. Luckily for them. She wasn't before, but she is now. But
So
worse,
is Roger Waters from Pink Floyd.
Yes, he is. He's a horrible, vicious anti-Jew hater. And I'm proud to say that even though I own a number of Pink Floyd albums, that was from before he lost his mind. A previous guy in Pink Floyd, Syd Barrett, also went insane, and so has Roger Waters, although he still hasn't been institutionalized yet. But anyway, Tucker Carlson puts on his podcast, whatever program, a professor who he calls the most important popular history writer in the United States, whose shtick is that in World War II, Churchill was the bad guy and Hitler was the victim. And that same guy who Tucker platformed and exposed to a mass audience of millions of people just in response to this week's Israeli preemptive attack against the Iranian nuclear program, put out a tweet saying that the United States should bomb Tel Aviv. So Tucker, I go back with Tucker to the late 1980s, but what he's become now is absolutely despicable.
I've heard some people suggest that Elon Musk, because he gave a salute, is anti-Semitic.
Well, no, not the salute thing is just a ginned-up issue, and that's an arm gesture that critics of that found zillions of Democrats making the same right-hand wave that he did. So that was stupid. Has he ever said things? Has he ever tweeted something that could be construed as anti-Semitic? Probably yes. I'm not sure that he really
Trump
means that.
anti-Semitic?
No, his daughter married a Jew. No, Trump is a lot of things, but anti-Jewish is not one of them.
So let's get back to the left-right issue.
Yeah.
As a generalization, American Jews have been connected to the Democratic Party and the progressive movement forever. I've never for the life of me understood why so many American Jews are anti-gun. You would think that any group that has been wiped out by authoritarianism would go, maybe we need to be armed. You don't see that in Israel, but you see it here. But now it is the left that is viciously anti-Semitic. You can go through congressmen, you can go through congresswomen here in the legislature. There is something different. In fact, I can see a day when America no longer backs Israel, because I believe there is this political shift that's going on through the country that is becoming pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli.
Pro-Palestinian is a misnomer, because if they cared about the actual people who live in Gaza, they certainly wouldn't be doing the kind of things they are. It's anti the American left. There are some of them who are absolutely viciously anti-Israel. Joe Biden may be the last Democratic nominee for a presidential nominee for a generation who is genuinely pro-Israel. And I had my disagreements with him about his Israeli policy, but in his heart, he considered himself to be pro-Israel. He would say, I'm a Zionist, meaning that the Jews, like other people, have a right to their own historic homeland. I don't think you'll find a Democratic nominee for president next time who says, I'm a Zionist.
Are there more anti-Semites on the left than the right now?
Yes, and there's certainly more, by far, and they're more politically influential. It's partly an alliance. There are people on the left, which you would say, communism as the extreme left, and then slightly toned down versions of that. That goes back to most of what they're saying today is just regurgitated Soviet Union propaganda lies from the 1960s and 70s and 80s, when the Soviet Union was the main backer of Yasser Arafat, the founder of the so-called Palestinian Liberation Organization, really the founder of modern terrorism. So there's that. But there are also some Muslims, I don't think a majority in the United States, but some of them who come from very anti-Semitic societies and also hate Jews, not from a communist perspective, but from a Muslim perspective, and or what some might say is a misinterpretation of proper Islam. But in any case, they think they have a religious basis for doing that. And it's that alliance in the Democratic Party, particularly in the Democratic primaries, that are quite influential. You saw after basically uncommitted or none of the above had a pretty good showing in the Michigan primary for president in 2024, running only against Joe Biden. You know, and I voted early so I could vote for Dean Phillips in the Colorado primary. The Democratic Party institutionally started to shift into a more anti-Israel, more neutral position between the Israel versus Hamas.
I know that our governor, Jared Polis, would like to be president sometime. I don't see him ever becoming president, not because he's gay. Nobody cares about that. I don't know if a Jewish man could get the Democratic nomination for president.
I think that's a very legitimate question, and the answer is look in 2024 when Kamala Harris suddenly had to pick a vice president, and a lot of people said that, well, the strongest person you could get is Joshua Shapiro, who's the governor of Pennsylvania. He won by a comfortable margin.
And you need Pennsylvania to win. You cannot win without Pennsylvania.
There's no path to victory for her that doesn't have Pennsylvania in it. And he's moderate compared to the Democratic Party in the high-end Democratic Party context, has a good style and is pro-Israel, although he toned down some of that already. But yeah, the Harris campaign essentially said, well, if we do that, that'll help on the one hand, but it's going to cost us on the other hand. And so they went with
because you're going to lose more votes having a Jew on the ticket.
Right.
Then, all right.
And so they nominated Tim Walz, who actually, it can be revealed, he's actually quite rich because he is the platonic model of the nincompoop, incompetent dad that all commercials are based on these days.
All right, let's wrap this up. Take a look in the crystal ball. Where does this grow from Colorado? And I to see Boulder City Council put out a resolution against what happened up in Boulder, and to have a councilwoman vote against it because it said something about Israel. And the council resolution, which was adopted by everybody except for one person on the city council, so they did the right thing, called the attack on the Run for Our Lives group an anti-Semitic attack, which it was. She wouldn't join with that because she said, no, it wasn't anti-Semitic, it was merely anti-Zionist. So the vast majority of Jews believe that Israel has a right to exist. Some Jews disagree with that. And so she was saying it was just against the Zionists. But it shows how out of touch she is with the city she purports to represent as an at-large person elected citywide. Because that particular march, and I know some people who participated in that march is solely in support of the Israelis Israeli hostages.
and people from Thailand and Americans and people of other nationalities kidnapped and held hostage by Hamas. It is not and has never been about any other broader policy issue like the war between Israel and Hamas. And in fact, one of my friends is an anti-Zionist Jew, not at all supportive of Israel, but she still participated in that because there were people being held hostage in Gaza, and all she meant by participating in that was free the hostages. And so the city councilwoman was also out of touch with that by imagining, without apparently talking to any of the people who ever participated in that march, imagining that this was in favor of the Israeli government.
People who are watching who are Jewish, I hope that they reconsider their political alliances. I look at where most Jews have voted, where they have given support, the organizations that they've been members of, and these are organizations that often disempower Jews. These are the organizations that are anti-gun, that disarmed those Jews in Boulder and other people who might have been able to defend themselves. I look at the left, which is pushing a very anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish agenda, and I keep wondering, what are you guys thinking? How can you still be aligned with a political movement that is basically out to kill you?
A fair question, and I'd say a sociological answer is, if you look at American Jews in let's say 1969, and they said, oh, actually, I think this government spending is getting kind of out of control, and some of these big government programs aren't working. Maybe I agree more with the Republicans because I think Bob Dole is a reasonable fellow, and he usually makes common sense when I read what he said in the newspaper. But then they would also say, no, but I don't want to get involved in the Republicans because they've got too many of these right-wing, nutty Christian preachers who, some of them overtly anti-Semitic or fellow travelers with that. And so they said, I don't feel comfortable with the Republicans. But that allegiance is long expired. In Republican circles in Colorado, if you say there's a problem with the Jews, your future in the Republican Party is over, and not so in the Democratic Party. And political parties change. Black people were very loyal to the Republican Party for many decades because they're understandably grateful for Abraham Lincoln and Reconstruction and all that, and the Democratic Party being the hotbed of the unreconstructed neo-Confederate South. But then in the 60s, that began to change. The Democratic Party became the party that was more pro-black, more aggressive on civil rights and things like that. And so most blacks shifted their allegiance. I think it's time for Jews to reconsider whether their historical loyalty to the Democratic Party is being repaid by the Democratic Party's loyalty to them. At the 2024 Democratic National Convention, the Jewish Democrats had to schedule their meeting in a secret room, which you wouldn't find out about until the guest list got notified by email at the very last minute, because within the Democratic Party, within the delegates at the convention, there were so many people who would come and do mob attacks against the Jews. Do you want to be in the party that if you have the Jewish Democrats, you're at risk of a mob attack by your fellow delegates of the National Convention? Because if you go to the Republican National Convention, you don't have to worry about an anti-Jewish mob coming at you.
What do you say to American Jews who are anti-gun?
It's too much of a cultural artifact of your days when you thought of Jews as being really good with words and books and numbers, and my son's a lawyer, my daughter's a doctor, and all that. And so we don't do the physical world, but the Zionist mentality is the Jews have bodies and they can use them and do them well and be effective. And nobody else is coming to save you. Jews, like every other persecuted minority group, need to be their own first responders.
Get a gun?
If you're willing to if you're willing to do it responsibly, yes.
Dave, thanks so much. I always learn something. Until next week, think freedom.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.